Hi everyone, today I'm going to be doing a quick review of The 10,000 Doors of January by Alix E. Harrow. This is another one of the books that's part of my Hugo Awards reading project. It's on the list of finalists for Best Novel. This is the fourth book from the Best Novel finalists list that I've read so far, and I did like it, but it was actually my least favorite out of the four books that I've read, and I think in some ways it felt more like a debut than the other two books that are also first novels. But it also had some really great writing and there were some really great things about it. I think that some people are really going to love this book. It just wasn't 100% my favorite kind of book. It was also pretty short. It was about 350 pages, so I read it basically in the span of an afternoon, but I do have a preference for books that are a little more in-depth and a little more immersive, and usually that means books that are a little bit longer because I think 350 pages is just not enough time to really fully flesh out a world. The story is set in the early 1900s. It's about a girl named January Scholar who is being raised by Mr. Locke, her father's patron. She's being raised as his ward while her father goes and searches for archaeological artifacts and other rare things and sends them back to Mr. Locke. So her father is traveling pretty much most of the time and she doesn't really see him at all while she's growing up. January is mixed race, but she's getting raised by a wealthy white guy, so she avoids most of the time most of the prejudice and things that she would have normally been dealing with in the early 1900s. But it is something that gets addressed later on in the book as she goes more out into the world and has to deal with more different types of characters. As a child, she's really wild and exuberant and doesn't really fit into the mold. But then one time while she's traveling with her guardian, she finds a door that seems to lead to another world. And when she tells Mr. Locke about this, he gets very angry and basically puts a lot of restrictions on her so that she becomes trained to be more obedient and a proper young lady, and she's brought up to basically avoid disobeying him. Eventually, when she turns 17, she finds or is given a book called The 10,000 Doors that starts explaining a lot more to her about her origins and these doors that she discovered one of and about her identity. So the book covers rather quickly the period from when she is about 7 up through 17, and then the majority of the book's action takes place when she's 17 after she has the book. This book is actually a really good example of how an author can cover a character's life and backstory in just a few chapters, showing her perspective as she grows up and just giving really good background without needing a bunch of flashbacks or exposition. I'll say straight up that this is not a very adventurous book, despite the promise of 10,000 doors, and you think you might go to a bunch of different worlds and there'll be a lot of adventure, but really it's more of a book of January discovering her own identity and who she is, and a sort of internal discovery rather than more of an external adventure, although there are some different worlds involved. The book includes a few different literary tropes. In fact, in my mind, it's a little bit too much given the length of the book, but it's both a portal fantasy, meaning you have characters from our world going into other worlds, but there's also a story within a story in the book, and so that's sort of two pretty common literary devices packed together in one book. I also should mention there's also a dog that plays a pretty important role in this book, so if you like dogs and dog stories, I really enjoyed that part, so you might like that too. His name is Bad, by the way, which is cute. I felt like for me, the story within a story narrative wasn't very compelling for me. It did give a lot of information that we needed, but I felt like I figured out way quicker than January what was actually going on in this book that she was reading and how it related to her, and it did seem pretty obvious. I'm not sure if I was supposed to find that narrative as compelling as the main narrative or if it was just there for information. But if I was supposed to care about what was happening in that book as much as in the main story, that wasn't very effective for me. I feel like the characters, especially January, is where this book really shines. I feel like all of them, or at least the important ones, are pretty complex and believable. You like them, but also they have different motivations and different feelings. And except for a few really cartoonish bad guys, you basically understand where the motivations and complexities of the characters are coming from. I also thought that Harrow did a really good job of showing January's perspective as a child, and even as a 17-year-old, her coming of age but not really fully adult perspective. I thought that was done really well. Ironically, the one thing that I didn't really find as compelling about January's character was her as a reader and story lover. She's supposed to be obsessed with serialized stories and pulpy fiction and the kinds of things that were being published in the early 1900s. And I know the whole book was sort of supposed to be about the power of words and stories, but somehow that element of it, even though it was key to the whole concept, was actually something that I didn't find worked as well. And I don't know why. I couldn't really relate to January as a reader. And that's coming from somebody that reads a lot. I don't know, maybe somebody else would somehow connect to that in the book better. I can't really put my finger on why it didn't really work for me, but that was a problem that I had. I wouldn't quite call this book magical realism because there's a little too much fantasy for that, but it definitely is strongly grounded in our world and things in our world and our history. I see that the author's next book is set in a similar time period, and it's about witches in the suffragette movement. So I think I'm sort of sensing a trend from her about using fantasy to sort of illuminate and connect to real world history and real world events and issues. I don't mean to pigeonhole any author. Maybe that's not all that she is going to write in the future, but that's definitely something that I see in her writing right now. I see that before she was an author, she was previously a historian of African and American history, and you really do get that flavor and that influence in her book. I actually saw some parallels between The 10,000 Doors of January and another book on the Hugo's ballot, which is Middle Game by Shannon Maguire. Both books have a magic that isn't super well explained that has to do with the power of words and words changing reality. Middle Game is definitely a darker and more convoluted book, and they are very different. I don't want to say that they are similar. I don't think the reading experience is similar. Actually, in retrospect, I feel like even though I had mixed feelings about Middle Game, I probably enjoyed it a little bit more than The 10,000 Doors of January. I thought that it was a little bit better constructed, even though there were some issues, but that just as a whole, I think it was more effective. But I enjoyed both books. It was just interesting to me to see that theme between the two books. I think that The 10,000 Doors of January is a book that probably did do what it set out to do, and I think the right reader will be really sort of enchanted and swept away and charmed by this story. It's beautifully written. I can see why it got a lot of praise. It's not necessarily what I was looking for, and I think I was also kind of in a more critical mood this week, so maybe if I had come to it in a different mood, I might have even been more charmed by it myself. I guess for me, I don't think it contributes as much to the genre as the other three books on the Hugo's ballot that I've read so far, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be a really magical experience for some people to read it. I also noticed out of all the books on the Hugo's ballot that I've read so far, I basically enjoyed the first one the most, and it's kind of been, gradually downhill from there. So I hope I just didn't pick totally the wrong order to read these books in, but I have, I think, 2 more to read on the list, and then I'll be done with the best novel list. And I really would like to see more from Alix Harrow. I think that she has a lot to offer as an author, and there was a lot to like about this book. I'm curious to know, for those of you that have read this book, how did you feel about it, or how do you feel about the things that I've said about it? Because I did see that it has been getting a lot of praise. I know this was a shorter review. I just somehow didn't feel like I had a ton to say about the book. Maybe also because I read it pretty quickly. I haven't had as much time to sit on it as I have for some of the other books that I've reviewed. But I'm looking forward to reading the last 2 books on the best novels list and seeing what I think of those and giving those a review as well.